47 a.m. 7 December 1941. A quiet Sunday morning over Oahu until the sky began to snarl. From the north came a low, rising thunder, the kind you feel in your ribs before you understand what it is. People looked up, expecting a drill, an exercise, some routine flyover. Instead, they saw formation after formation, sleek shapes dropping out of the clouds, wings flashing, engines screaming, turning the bright Hawaiian air into a vibrating sheet of noise. The first wave counted 183 aircraft, moving with rehearsed precision. At their head was a strike leader, an experienced aviator who had trained for this exact approach for months. His orders were blunt: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet while it still slept at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Japan's war machine had expanded across Asia, but an American oil embargo was tightening like a vice. Fuel was life. Without it, ships stopped, aircraft stayed grounded, and momentum died. The planners believed they needed one decisive blow, one shock so brutal that the United States would hesitate, negotiate, or at least lose the ability to respond quickly. So they aimed at the battleships, lined up neatly in the harbor, big steel symbols of American power, sitting close enough to touch. Below, sailors were waking up, shaving, joking, half-dressed, thinking about breakfast. Coffee cups clinked. Someone laughed at a bad joke. Somewhere, a radio played music that had nothing to do with war. On Ford Island, a young serviceman noticed planes diving toward the water and squinted hard against the sun. Then he saw the red markings on the wings and felt his stomach drop. A second later, the first bombs fell. "Move! Get down!" Shouts snapped across the decks and piers. The harbor turned from calm to chaos in a heartbeat. The attackers split into groups, each with a job. Torpedo bombers at wave-top height, dive bombers dropping like stones, fighters sweeping ahead to strafe airfields and silence defenses. Torpedo bombers skimmed the surface so low it seemed impossible, roughly 40 feet above the water. Their torpedoes had been modified with wooden fins so they wouldn't plunge too deep in the shallow harbor. It was an ugly, clever adjustment, a solution built for a place the attackers had studied obsessively. They lined up on Battleship Row. USS Oklahoma was hit early and hard. A lookout spotted the incoming planes and lunged for the general alarm. But seconds vanished. Much of the anti-aircraft ammunition was locked in secured storage. Keys and authorization were with officers ashore. The first torpedo slammed home with a sound like the world cracking. Steel ripped. Water poured in. The massive hull shuddered, then began to list. Inside, corridors filled with darkness and rising seawater. Ladders became angled ramps as the deck turned into a wall. Men scrambled, slipping on slick metal, shouting names, dragging friends. Some made it. Some didn't. In compartments below the waterline, hands banged on bulkheads, thump, thump, thump signals that grew weaker as the ship rolled further and air pockets disappeared. Across the harbor, dive bombers screamed down nearly vertical. 8:06 a.m. USS Arizona took a hit that turned the morning into a nightmare. A heavy bomb struck near the forward section and detonated ammunition below. The explosion was not just loud, it was catastrophic. A giant's punch that tore the ship open and turned the air into a wave. Fire burst upward. Shockwave and heat threw men into the water. Burning fuel spread in a fast, oily bloom that set the surface alight. A mechanic who had been working on a nearby vessel surfaced in a pool of flame, coughing, eyes stinging, swimming through fire because staying still meant death. Above, the strike leader circled higher, scanning the harbor through rising smoke columns. Several ships burned at once. Oklahoma rolled, belly up, its hull exposed like a wounded whale. Arizona became an inferno, glowing with a terrible orange light. And then a colder thought surfaced, one that mattered more than any battleship. Where are the carriers? The harbor was packed with battleships, but the aircraft carriers, fast, flexible, future-defining, were not there. The most dangerous weapons were missing. Out at sea, beyond the reach of bombs and torpedoes. On Ford Island, a gunner dragged a .50 caliber machine gun into the open and began firing into the attacking aircraft. Bullets kicked up dirt and splinters around him. Shrapnel bit into his arm. He kept firing anyway, jaw locked, eyes narrowed, refusing to stop. Every burst was a statement. You don't get to do this unchallenged. In the channel, USS Helm, a destroyer, tried to run for open water. Tracer fire stitched the sea around it, bright lines slashing the surface. Rounds punched holes in the superstructure. The ship lurched and shivered, but its helm held and it kept moving, clawing toward the harbor mouth like an animal refusing to be trapped. Near the dry docks, USS Pennsylvania sat exposed, unable to maneuver. Bombs fell onto deck and mast, throwing fragments and smoke into the air. Elsewhere, oil fires crawled across the water. Men leapt from decks to escape smoke. Others stayed, passing ammunition hand to hand, dragging hoses, trying to keep a burning ship from becoming a sinking ship. A message crackled through American command centers. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. By 8:54 a.m., a second wave arrived, roughly 170 more aircraft. But Pearl Harbor had changed. The defenders were awake now. Anti-aircraft fire climbed into the sky in angry arcs. Sailors jammed shells into guns with shaking hands. Officers screamed orders until their voices went raw. The air filled with black puffs of flak that looked like bruises forming in the sky. The second wave found a harbor fighting back. Some guns overheated and jammed. Some crews fired with whatever ammunition they could find. Some men worked half-blind, eyes watering from smoke and cordite. The sky turned into a violent chessboard. Attackers diving, defenders tracking, shells bursting, aircraft weaving. USS Nevada managed to get underway. Her engines rumbled, and she began pushing toward the channel, guns roaring back. A young officer stepped into a fire control position just as shrapnel tore into his leg, nearly severing it. He cinched a tourniquet, clenched his teeth, and stayed at his post. Pain mattered less than the job. Nevada's guns continued to thunder, each blast shaking the ship like a heartbeat. Then came an order that sounded like defeat but was actually survival. Beach her. If Nevada sank in the narrow channel, the entire base could be blocked, trapping every ship inside like fish in a net. So the battleship swung and deliberately ran aground near the harbor entrance, stranded by choice. Still firing, buying time. Japanese aircraft poured bombs onto the grounded ship and any target still visible through smoke. Airfields were strafed, hangars burned. Planes on the ground were destroyed before they could ever lift off. Ammunition trucks exploded. Fuel fires fed on the wind. The soundscape became unreal. Engines, explosions, alarms, shouted orders, and under everything the constant hiss of fire meeting seawater. Still, a few fighters did lift off. At an airfield inland, 2 American pilots sprinted toward their aircraft as explosions rippled in the distance. With almost no information and barely enough time to think, they took off into the chaos. They climbed through smoke, spotted enemy aircraft rising from their attack runs, and pressed in. Machine guns barked. One attacker flamed out and fell. Then another. It was small compared to the scale of the raid, but it was something proof that the sky would not be surrendered for free. At 9:45 a.m., a flare signaled withdrawal. The attacking formation turned north and vanished toward open sea, returning to carriers waiting beyond the horizon. Below, Pearl Harbor burned. Thick black smoke rolled upward in heavy columns. The water was smeared with oil and scattered with debris, wood, metal, helmets, scraps of paper, the small remnants of people's ordinary routines. The harbor smelled like fuel and salt and something worse. Hundreds of men swam through slick, flaming water, grabbing ropes, clinging to capsized hulls, helping strangers, yelling for friends who never answered. On shattered decks, officers and sailors formed human chains, passing the wounded hand to hand toward small boats. In some places, the rescue was a race against heat. Steel plates so hot they blistered skin. Smoke so thick it turned daylight into dusk. Men wrapped shirts around their mouths, crawled through corridors, and followed the feel of a bulkhead with their fingertips because they couldn't see. When the immediate bombing stopped, the work did not. It intensified. Fires had to be fought. Flooding had to be contained. Ammunition had to be secured before it cooked off. Trapped sailors had to be found. Divers would later slip into wreckage, listening for tapping, cutting through steel, praying they were not too late. At the Naval Hospital, the injured arrived in a relentless stream. They lay on floors, tables, benches, anywhere there was space. Some were burned. Some were blinded. Some were shock-silent, staring at nothing. Medical staff worked until their sleeves were stiff with dried blood, until their hands shook with exhaustion, until the only thing left was focus. The raid lasted about 90 minutes. The consequences lasted years. By the end, 2,403 Americans were dead and more than 1,000 were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Oklahoma, Arizona, and Utah were lost completely. Others like California and West Virginia would later be raised, repaired, and returned to service. Nevada, too, would be salvaged, rebuilt, and fight on. But the raid, for all its horror, failed to land the deepest blow. The aircraft carriers were not in port. The fuel tanks, repair facilities, and submarine-based critical infrastructure that would allow the United States to recover quickly were largely left intact. The attackers had aimed at the visible symbols of power and missed the less glamorous assets that actually make a fleet lethal: logistics, maintenance, and the ability to keep moving after you've been hit. In other words, they hit the fist, but didn't break the arm behind it. And the strike did something else that can't be measured in ship tonnage or bomb counts. It unified a nation. The next day, America's leader addressed the country and demanded a response that left no doubt. A nation that had argued about entering the war suddenly moved as one. Recruiting offices overflowed. Families listened to the radio in stunned silence. Factories pivoted. Shipyards expanded. Assembly lines ran longer, faster, harder. The industrial engine of the United States began to turn toward total war. And once it started, it did not slow down. Japan had wagered everything on a single decisive strike. But decisive doesn't mean loud. It means final. And Pearl Harbor was not final. It was ignition. In the months that followed, the war in the Pacific intensified. Convoy routes hunted, islands contested, submarines stalking, shipping lanes, pilots learning and adapting fast because the cost of learning was measured in lives. 6 months later, American and Japanese carriers would collide in a battle that reshaped the course of the Pacific War, proof that the era of the battleship had ended and the era of the carrier had begun. Pearl Harbor, then, is more than a story of explosions and smoke. It's a lesson in what leaders choose to target, what they overlook, and how a single morning can flip a country's direction like a switch. And it's a reminder that surprise is only the first chapter. What happens next is decided by what you do after the shock wears off. For decades, historians have argued about what-ifs. What if a third wave had come aimed at fuel storage, repair shops, dry docks, and the submarine pens? Could it have bought Japan more time? Or would it have simply exposed the attackers to stronger defenses and cost them planes they couldn't replace? The debate matters because it shows how thin the line can be between a dramatic raid and a decisive campaign. But on that morning, inside the smoke and chaos, nobody was thinking in decades. They were thinking in seconds. One more breath, one more pull on a hose, one more wounded man carried to a boat, one more gun brought online. Pearl Harbor was a strategic turning point, but it was also thousands of individual choices made under fire. Even today, the images are hard to shake. Smoke rising over bright water, sirens echoing off steel. The sudden realization that distance and ocean are not guarantees of safety. Pearl Harbor became a symbol. Yes, but it was also thousands of individual moments. Someone pulling a stranger from the water. Someone refusing to leave a gun. Someone making a split-second choice that saved a ship, a channel, or a life.
The attack was over, but the war had just begun. America's resolve was unbroken as the...
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. The time has come to defend our shores. Join the U.S. Marines and serve your country with honor.
The attack on Pearl Harbor woke a sleeping giant, and across the nation, men answered the call to defend freedom.
Across the nation, the response was immediate. A tide of volunteers, united in their resolve, stepped forward.
The USS Loring steamed westward, a steel giant bracing for a storm that would change the world forever.
Against impossible odds, they fought back. For freedom, For their brothers on the sea, they flew into the fire.
They stood prepared for war, unaware of the approaching storm that would change everything.
The journey across the storm-tossed Pacific symbolized the arduous conflict that had just begun.